My time in naval aviation was cut short. It tragically crashed and burned after being fought out by short-sighted leadership decisions. However, another proud lion appeared on my horizon, one that restored my sense of adventure and eventually helped me reconnect with the black lions of VF-213. This allowed me to discover the ultimately uplifting and historic fate of lions. Grumman built 712 F-14 Tomcats, and although the fleet was largely scrapped following its retirement, multiple examples are preserved in museums and air parks around the country. And in fact, these aircraft are some of the most popular displays at those facilities. I've had a chance to visit several aircraft across multiple states, and I wanted to take you on a little tour with me of these jets. We're going to do this in construction order, from the oldest to the youngest jet I visited. However, this is not going to include any of the aircraft I have a personal connection with. I'll discuss those Tomcats in a later chapter. To begin this nationwide tour of the Tomcats that I've had a chance to visit, we're going to start up on Long Island in New York, where we're going to visit Bureau 157982. This is the third Tomcat ever built and the oldest one still in existence. This Tomcat was used during flight testing in the early 1970s, making its first flight in December of 1971. This Tomcat is most famous for the photo of it flying with its wings in an asymmetrical position. This was a test done to prove to the Navy that even if the wing sweep mechanism malfunctioned and you had one wing sticking out and the other wing folded back, the aircraft could still safely land aboard a carrier. This aircraft last flew in 1990 and was acquired by the Cradle of Aviation Museum in Garden City, New York in 1995. Here in Pensacola, the National Naval Aviation Museum presents visitors with an iconic tableau. Visitors walk up to the museum and the first thing they're greeted with is an F-14 with its wings swept back, forever zipping across the front of the museum. This is Bureau number 157984. This was actually the fifth airframe ever built, and its entire operational history was used as a test bed. This aircraft came to the museum in 1989, and it is believed to be the first Tomcat ever put on public display. Over the past quarter century, this aircraft has become the greatest icon associated with the National Naval Aviation Museum. For our next Tomcat, we're going to zip back up to the Empire State and go aboard USS Intrepid, CV-11, centerpiece of Manhattan's Intrepid Museum. On board is F-14 Delta Bureau number 157986. This was the seventh airframe ever built, and like the fifth airframe, this one spent its operational career as a testing platform. Heading south to the Old Dominion, we're going to stop by Naval Air Station Oceana in Virginia Beach, Virginia. Oceana's air park used to play home to Bureau number 157988. This was the ninth Tomcat ever built, and the last time I saw it back in 2002, it was painted in the colors of VF-213 following our deployment. Unfortunately, this airframe suffered too much structural damage and was scrapped in 2004. Tomcat 157988 has been replaced on display. In its place now is Bureau number 164604, which happens to be the last Tomcat ever built. Moving down to Charleston, South Carolina, just a little bit outside Charleston. Bureau number 159025 sits aboard the USS Yorktown, CV-10. Yorktown is another World War II carrier, and it is the it's the centerpiece of the Patriots Point Naval and Maritime Museum. This is an F-14 Alpha, and this was the 86th aircraft ever built. This next aircraft is pretty historically significant, but it's also got a personal significance to me, even though I never worked on it. This next aircraft we're going to look at is the first one I ever saw on display with a tarps pod. The Stephen F. Udvar-Hazy Center in Chantilly, Virginia is a branch of the Smithsonian's National Air and Space Museum. It houses F-14 Delta Bureau number 159610. This was the 157th aircraft built out of the 712. Originally, it was an Alpha model assigned to the VF-32 Fighting Swordsman. Back on the 4th of January in 1989, this aircraft and another Swordsman jet downed 2 Libyan MiGs which were behaving in a hostile fashion. The jet was later rebuilt into a Delta model and assigned to the VF-31 Tomcatters, where it ended up becoming part of the longest Tomcat cruise in history. USS Abraham Lincoln, CVN-72, and Carrier Air Wing 14 deployed on July 20, 2002 for a normal 6-month deployment. However, the commencement of Operation Iraqi Freedom diverted the carrier, extending the cruise from 6 months to 10 months. They did not get home until May 6, 2003, having made the longest deployment in Tomcat history. My old stomping grounds of NAS Fallon, Nevada is home to F-14 Alpha Bureau number 159626. This is either the 173rd or the 175th Tomcat ever built. I found both construction numbers in the various sources I researched. F-14 Alpha, Bureau number 160661 is at the U.S. Space and Rocket Center in Huntsville, Alabama. This is the 280th airframe built. This jet was attached to the VF-51 Screaming Eagles when VF-51 and Carrier Air Wing 15 deployed aboard USS Carl Vinson, CVN-70, during the carrier's maiden deployment back in March of 1983. This airframe was later used by NASA for testing to improve F-14 maneuverability. Alrighty, y'all. Saddle up your horses, get your cowboy boots on, grab your 10-gallon hats. We're heading down to the Lone Star State and my native state of Texas. Specifically, we're heading down to Corpus Christi and visiting the USS Lexington CV-16, yet another World War II carrier that is the center point of a maritime museum. Aboard the Lexington is Bureau number 160694. This is an F-14 Bravo. It is the 313th aircraft ever built, the second one I ever saw with a tarps pod on display. And for movie buffs, this particular airframe was one of the ones used in filming the 1986 movie Top Gun. I cannot tell you exactly when it appeared on screen in the movie, but it was on screen in that movie numerous times. So if you're a movie buff, head on down to Corpus Christi, step aboard the USS Lexington, and you will get to see one of the aircraft that filmed Top Gun. F-14 Alpha Bureau number 160902 flies high above Grumman Memorial Park in Calverton, New York. This is the 331st Tomcat built. This aircraft was attached to VF-84, operating from USS John F. Kennedy, CV-67, off Naval Air Station Roosevelt Roads in Puerto Rico when it collided with a Tomcat from VF-32 on the 5th of December, 1979. This aircraft safely returned to the ship despite being damaged, but the other Tomcat, Bureau number 159022, crashed, tragically killing both aircrew. Today, Bureau number 160902 helps anchor Grumman Memorial Park. The park preserves the legacy of Grumman Aerospace on the former site of Grumman's final assembly and flight test center in Calverton, New York, where the F-14 Tomcat first took to the sky. We're going to drive east to Sweet Home, Alabama, and stop by Mobile, where USS Alabama, BB-60, is the centerpiece of Battleship Memorial Park. Among their collection is the 470th Tomcat ever built, Bureau number 161611. This is an Alpha model, but it has tarps modifications. So if you had a tarps pod you wanted to donate to Battleship Memorial Park, they could put it on this aircraft and it would be a proper display. F-14 Alpha, Bureau number 162608, lives at the Southern Museum of Flight in Birmingham, Alabama. This was the 530th Tomcat built. This aircraft flew with the VF-41 Black Aces off the carrier USS Enterprise, CVN-65, during Operation Enduring Freedom. On a trivia note, I first saw this aircraft in April of 2002 at NAS Oceana. She was in Hangar 200, which is the depot level maintenance hangar. Depot level maintenance is where the aircraft is pretty much stripped down to bare bones, cleaned, refurbished, rebuilt, and then assigned to another squadron. The next aircraft is another part of the collection here at the Naval Aviation Museum. I first saw it in 2006, but I didn't know I'd seen it. I didn't know I'd photographed it. I did not know it existed until yesterday. Yesterday being April 19th, 2025. I'm going to talk more about this story in a few minutes. But back in 2006, my father and I got a behind-the-scenes tour here at the Naval Aviation Museum, part of which was out on the flight line where a lot of aircraft that are not on display are stored. We were specifically there to see another F-14 that had just arrived. I, of course, took a couple of wide-angle shots just to show the aircraft collection. I was going through those photos yesterday, 19 April 2025, when I discovered that in the background was an F-14 I didn't know was there and I didn't know I'd photographed. This is Bureau number 162710. It's an F-14 Alpha model, and it is the 556th Tomcat ever built. It is currently still sitting in storage on the flight line out behind the museum. Hopefully, it'll be accessible to the public before too much longer. Bureau number 162916 is on display outside Veterans of Foreign Wars Post 8896 in East Berlin, Pennsylvania. This is an F-14 Bravo, and she's the 564th aircraft built. The furthest west you can find a Tomcat on display is at the Pearl Harbor Aviation Museum, located on Ford Island in Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. This is Felix 102, an F-14 Delta, Bureau number 163904. Felix 102 is the 614th Tomcat built. She was supposed to make the very final Tomcat flight ever, but a technical issue grounded her and another Tomcat made that flight. You will get to meet that Tomcat later in this episode. Felix 102 was carried to Hawaii for display aboard USS Bonhomme Richard, LHD-6. The aircraft was positioned prominently on the bow by herself as the ship got near Oahu, and some observers watching Bonhomme Richard enter Pearl Harbor described the Tomcat sitting prominently out there by herself as kind of looking like a hood ornament. I'd like to take a minute and look at F-14 Alpha Bureau number 158634. This aircraft never went on display to the public. She was scrapped when the Tomcat fleet was retired, and I was never able to find a construction number for her, so I don't know in what order she was built. I encountered this aircraft in 2002 while it was undergoing depot-level maintenance at NAS Oceana. I wanted to include those photos in this chapter because the aircraft was stripped down to its bare airframe. This is a very unique opportunity to present to you the complex and intricate level of engineering and construction it took to build an F-14 Tomcat. I had a lot of fun putting together this little partial tour of F-14s on display around the country. So these are all F-14s I've actually seen. And in order to produce this documentary, I made several road trips this year up into Alabama, Tennessee, Illinois, and New York, and Pennsylvania. And I loved every minute of it. An interesting note about this is that many of these aircraft are actually in the permanent collection of the National Naval Aviation Museum here in Pensacola. The museum has deployed these aircraft around the country on long-term and even permanent loan to these other facilities in order to ensure the Tomcat story continues to soar for generations to come. Former aviation structural mechanic second class James Ciarino and I knew each other at VF-213, but James was lucky enough to be part of the final Tomcat deployment. One of his funniest memories was on Liberty, not the flight deck. He sent me this recollection and asked that I read it for him. This was aboard the Theodore Roosevelt during the last Tomcat cruise from '05 to '06. I was an AM2 and leading petty officer of corrosion control at the time. I was on Liberty with an AM3 named Miller. Me and Miller stayed past Cinderella Liberty one night in Palma. We sort of spent too much time at a Fiji-themed island bar owned by an English gentleman. We were drinking buckets of beer and conversing with two ladies from Liverpool. We had a bit too much fun, but it was a great night, and we never got back to the ship. Miller was hosed, and I was almost as bad. I had to watch him and, of course, be a good Liberty buddy since we missed the boat, so to speak. We walked around Palma, sobering up the rest of the night. The next day, after we napped in a park, we walked around still freaking hungover and looking for the Liberty bus pickup spot because the ship had moved it due to a security measure, and we didn't know that. We finally found some other sailors and asked them where the pickup was, and eventually we made our way back to the ship. Master Chief Seabolt, our maintenance Master Chief, was not happy about that stunt. Still, man, good times. The news of the Tomcat's retirement went out across the fleet in 2004 and 2005. At that time, the Navy put out a message to all the photographers' mates, such as myself, that those of us who were TARPS photographers, the ones that were in the F-14 community, if we did not want to be a mass communication specialist, which was specifically going to be a public affairs rate, and we had gotten into aviation maintenance, we had priority to cross-rate into an aviation career field. A number of photo mates I knew crossed over and became aviation electronics technicians, ATs. Makes sense. We'd all been inundated with the Lantern Pod. I did not choose to go that route because I'd already failed out of AT school back in 1998. Well, technically, I failed out in 1997. I just didn't go to yeoman school till 1998. I applied to go into aviation structural mechanics. So I did all the work, all the correspondence courses, took the test, sent my application package in, and right after I sent that application package in, the Navy sent out another message that said, nope, we're not doing it. Never mind. I cannot adequately express just how devastating that was to me. I had worked so long and so hard and been through so much to get to where I wanted to be. And now it was taken away because somebody in leadership decided to renege on a promise to sailors. If 9/11 hadn't already cemented my commitment to my country to stay in the Navy for a full career, I would have walked away at that point. At that moment, the Navy stopped being an adventure and it just became a job. I worked at the Office of Naval Intelligence for a little bit, and then I was an instructor at the Defense Information School for 3.5 years. That was a lot of fun, and that was a very meaningful job. I got to teach a lot of good, well, not just sailors. I taught service members from all 5 branches of service. I got to teach civilians. I even helped teach the officer course a couple of times. And it was a very good job, but it was just a job. One of the things I joined the Navy to do was be ship's company. Not just on the ship like when you're with the air wing and you're on the ship for the mission, but actually part of the crew. I was rolling to sea duty finally. Because of the scramble to our billets that this rating merger caused, I did shore duty 3 times back to back, which you're not supposed to be able to do. I went from shore duty on Guam to shore duty at Office of Naval Intelligence for a year, then to shore duty at the Defense Information School for 3.5 years because they had nowhere to stick me. Finally got sea duty coming up. Ended up getting a small amphibious assault ship, the last of the Austin-class amphibious transport docks, or LPDs, USS Ponce, LPD-15. Interestingly enough, her mascot and her crest is the Proud Lion. It struck me when I got those orders that the first time I went to sea was with the Black Lions. The first time I ever get ship's company is with the Proud Lion. Made a joke back then that maybe the lion should be my spirit guide. The years I spent as a Proud Lion largely restored my sense of adventure. The Proud Lion gave me back that feeling of being part of something truly special, that being a United States sailor was something to be proud of, that This wasn't just a job, it was an adventure. It it helped significantly that the ship's crew on board Ponce was only about 400 sailors. We could carry up to 1,000 Marines. And on our deployment, our 2010 to 11 deployment, we carried between 700 and 900 Marines, depending on the month. But the crew's only 400. That's about the same size as a squadron. Once again, I'm in an operational environment, finally, but it's a small enough environment where I know everybody by name, not just by face, but by name. Having that sense of pride restored is not something I can truly put into words. We were supposed to decom the Ponce in 2012. At that time, she was the third oldest ship in the Navy. Right in the middle of the decom procedure, we got basically kicked off, and the ship was handed over to the Military Sealift Command for use as an experimental afloat-forward staging base. She was the test bed for 5 years for this complete new concept for afloat-forward basing, and the Navy's building purpose-built ships now for that job. Proud Lion, she was the pioneer, and she did it first. Because the ship was so old, and we were about to decom in a couple of years originally planned, the Navy wasn't giving us jack. Our air search radar broke during deployment while we're supporting air operations. The Navy told us, don't worry about it. You don't need it. You're decomming in another year. We're supporting air operations. They wouldn't give us a freaking radar. Do you think they're going to give me any camera equipment? I managed to scrounge together an entire studio with spit baling wire in my imagination. I created my own green screens with green bed sheets. I was responsible for everything from the officers' official portraits to public affairs work to doing the cruise book and putting that together. I didn't have a studio, so I invented one out of thin air on the mess decks. I cleared part of the mess decks out, figured out how to simulate studio lighting by hanging cardboard up to block certain overhead lights and reflect other overhead lights where I needed them, hung up the green screens, and I would photograph all the personnel in front of the green screens. To create the background, I borrowed the American flag and the Navy flag from the quartermasters, and these are the flags we would hang up on the quarterdeck when we were in port. And then I wrote on them. I've always had a problem reversing where the Navy flag and the American flag stand when you're setting up a studio. I took a ballpoint pen and wrote a little L on the hoist of the Navy flag and a little R on the hoist of the American flag. Got them hung up, photographed the flags, took them down, restored them to the quartermaster, and then went about my business by photographing everybody in front of the green screens. Little tricks I figured out like that enabled me to provide the kind of media support that my new shipmates deserved. I wound up with 3 flags from the Ponce. One of them completely by accident because I kind of stole it. The other 2 after she was decommissioned. This is the Navy Jack we flew for the entire 2 years I was aboard the ship. The 2 years of that deployment, 2010 to 2012. I was on watch as we were starting the decom process when Admiral Harvey, who was Commander of Fleet Forces at the time, was scheduled to come aboard for an inspection. I was at the quarterdeck podium getting ready to turn the watch over to the next watch when our color guard came up to get the colors to stand by for morning colors, because they were going to do colors and then Admiral Harvey would come right on board. We pulled the Navy Jack out. I was horrified to discover, or I should say realize, the fly end had frayed all to hell. This flag had been flying in all kinds of weather for a couple of years at least. And you can see from this video that I have done a lot of stitching on it to stabilize the flag and keep it from fraying apart any further. And when I realized that, I said, there's no way we're putting this up with Admiral Harvey coming on. So I turned the watch over to the next watch, grabbed this, and ran to the bridge. One of my quartermaster buddies, Jim Wagner, was there. And I told him, Jim, we got to have another Navy Jack. We can't show this to the Admiral. He and I ran into the flag lock, and we're throwing flags back and forth. And I took this and I shoved it into the pocket on my uniform pants. Find one last Navy Jack. So I take it, run to the quarterdeck, hand it to the watch. They walk off. Colors happens right then. It goes up, and Admiral Harvey comes up the brow. Oh, ship doesn't look bad. I got home that night, put my uniform in the wash, and what the hell's in my pocket? I'd accidentally stolen the old Navy Jack. At that time, I figured the Navy Jack would be the single most unique memento I ever had from the Ponce. I didn't realize, or I didn't even have a clue, however, it was only the first of 3 flags I'd end up with. I retired from the Navy in 2017 after a 20-year career. Navy Jack now fades into history for about 5 years, but it will return. About 2 or 3 weeks later, in early October, USS Ponce was decommissioned. I was still living in a hotel because I had sold my house, put my stuff in storage, and was tying up my affairs in Virginia before I moved back to Florida and started a year-long Grand Tour USA, seeing all 50 states and a little of Canada. I got a chance to revisit Ponce twice after her retirement before she left Norfolk for the Boneyard in Philadelphia. The first time was by myself, and I'm glad I had that time by myself because it was very moving to walk around and just relive my own memories, think about the good times, the bad times, the hard times, the exciting times, all those things. While I was on board, I came across two more flags. Had been quarterdeck flags. One was the Navy flag and one was an old American flag. The military Sea Lift Command guys told me I could keep them both. They were both going to be disposed of, so yeah, you can keep them, Chief Miller. Walked around and had a great time. Got back to my hotel, put those flags off to the side, and got on email and looked up a few of the guys that were still in the Norfolk area. So organized another reunion aboard Ponce. Well, I organized a reunion aboard Ponce for me and three other shipmates. Great time. We climbed all over that ship. We relived the glory days. We relived the gory days, the whole 9 yards. It was a lot of fun. It was very meaningful for all of us. I mentioned that I had gotten those flags from the MSC guys my previous visit, and the guys showed me some of the souvenirs they had been given by the MSC guys. Everything from signs on the doors that indicated what the space was to small fittings and uh, valve handles, small things like that that were going into the scrap metal pile. Headed back to the hotel that night, and I was thinking about the fact that I remember the old quarterdeck flags 7 years ago when I wrote on them. That would be hysterical if these flags I got today were those. And I picked up the Navy flag and I looked at it, and my eyeballs just oink. There on the hoist was the little letter L I had written 7 years prior when I used that flag to shoot cruise book photos. What are the odds the American flag is the same one? Yeah, right, not going to happen. So I pick up the American flag and looked at it, and my jaw hits the deck. There is that little R I had written in 2010. The two quarterdeck flags that I had written on and used as a background to do cruise book photos 7 years later were now in my possession. I immediately had an idea. As I drove around the country and flew to Alaska and Hawaii, those flags were going to go with me. The Ponce was going to travel the country. Before the grand tour could start, I moved home to Florida and crashed with my folks, using the old family homestead as home base for this great adventure. Now that my career was over, I was looking back at it with a slightly different perspective and was beginning to realize just how much I had buried naval aviation in my memory because it had just hurt so much losing it. One of the first stops the Ponce flags were going to make was over at the Naval Aviation Museum in Pensacola, where one of the aircraft I had worked on back in my Black Lion days was now on display. So I brought the Ponce flags with me and symbolically, ceremonially introduced the VF-213 Black Lions to the USS Ponce, the Proud Lion. Moved to Washington State for a couple of years, and I planned to be there longer, but the way Washington State ran its pandemic response led me to get the hell out of there and come back home to Florida for, where I am now. But now all three flags are united. 2022, one of my Ponce shipmates, former operations specialist second class David Allen, and his wife were visiting Pensacola, and we got to go to the Aviation Museum. It's another one of those moments that's really difficult to put into words. I'm not just standing there with my aircraft and the flags, and those flags alone are very significant. I've got one of my old shipmates. David was also very impressed with how the Naval Aviation Museum is laid out because there are very few aircraft at this museum that you cannot walk up and touch. Most aircraft are very accessible for you to walk around and put your hands on and explore. It was cool to see you going off about the Tomcat. It was cool to get to experience that museum with good company, especially as we were able to walk up on aircraft we would never be able to get within 10 feet of in a normal museum. It truly was a once in a lifetime experience to see a museum display aircraft like that. There are 4 Black Lion aircraft that still exist, 4 jets that we worked on back in my day in VF-213 that are on display around the country. While producing this documentary, I didn't just visit the aircraft here in Pensacola. I also got on the road to go visit the other 3. I took the Ponce flags with me and photographed them while touring those aircraft. I'll show you those photos and tell you those stories in the next chapter, The Fate of Lions. My dad, Chief Master Sergeant William A. Miller, retired from a 30-year career in the United States Air Force in September 1996. I enlisted in the Navy in September 1997. Pop was aboard USS Carl Vinson for the Tiger Cruise the ship held at the end of our 2001-2002 deployment. I sat down with Pop and talked a bit about the Tiger Cruise in general and, more specifically, his thoughts about the Tomcats. You were a Tiger, so you came on the Tiger Cruise. You flew out to Hawaii, which is funny since you're from Hawaii. I remember how I found you on the pier with my telephoto lens.
I remember that. I was watching an aircraft carrier come in. It was awesome.
Got to take everybody, I got to show Grandma and Grandpa around.
You were walking the deck, the flight deck first, and explaining everything that was going on. And of course, my dad, who was Navy Reserve. Yeah, Navy Reserve, and was not able to get in as an active because he was sole support for his family. But he had worked on carriers, and he looked at me and he goes, "God damn, does this kid know everything?" Of course, I was proud, and Mom kind of smiled and says, "Probably does." I first heard about the Tomcat in 1981, when we saw The Final Countdown. One of your sons ends up suddenly working on the Tomcats. What was that like for you? It's called living vicariously through your children. Hey, Tomcat. Wow, he's working on Tomcat. I never thought about Tiger Cruise until you gave us the possibility that a Tiger Cruise was going to happen. It was great, but yeah, to get on board with Tomcat, awesome. They did the flyby, the air show for us Tigers, and of course you were working stiff, and once in a while you had to leave me alone, and I was always up in the crow's nest. Vulture's Row. Vulture's Row, that's right. Watching flight ops. I could sit up there all day and watch it. It's surreal when you're retired after 30 years in Air Force, and you're now in an aircraft carrier with your son, and it's an aircraft carrier that had been the first to launch Operation Enduring Freedom. Yeah, and I immersed myself. It's like I could do this. Well, 2002, Mom and Rosa came up, visited me at Oceana, and so of course got to take you out to the hangar. You and I got a great picture by Lion 111 triple sticks in the hangar. So of course you're seeing them now for the second time after seeing them on the flight deck. And then 4 years later, in 2006, the final Tomcat to ever make a combat mission is donated to the museum. For Father's Day, I got a behind-the-scenes tour at the museum. Yep. The docent drove us around, talked about the aircraft collection, and finally we got a Tomcat. So we're walking around, then you and the docent were talking, and I kind of moved off on my own to go reminisce a little bit. Looked at the bureau number, did a double take, and said, "Pop, I know this aircraft. I worked on it." Surreal experience. Especially since, how the hell did you recognize this airplane? The bureau number, Dad. Okay, I didn't know there was a bureau number. And it's interesting as a father watching his son that's my aircraft. it was great. I can do it. That's life. That's nostalgia. That's coming back to good times or meaningful times. Hands down, the 14 is the most beautiful fighter I've seen. They just have a rake design that just looks like they're moving. Awesome airplane. Four Tomcats that were with us on that deployment still exist.
One of the others crashed and the rest were all scrapped. I'm going to take you through the ones that were scrapped or crashed and then move into the ones that still exist. Lion 100, Bureau number 164348, was scrapped. Lion 102, Bureau number 163901, was scrapped. Lion 103, Bureau number 163899, was scrapped. Lion 104, Bureau number 159628, was scrapped. Lion 107, Bureau number 164344, crashed into the ocean about 2 miles west of Point Loma, California, back in March of 2004. Lion 110, Bureau number 164347, was scrapped. Lion 112, Bureau number 164602, was marked for scrapping and was possibly broken up this year. Former Lions 101, 105, 106, and 111 survived the scrapper's torch and are on display to the public today. 111, Bureau number 161159, is here in Pensacola at the Naval Aviation Museum, and I've already used footage of that aircraft numerous times in this documentary. We'll be talking more about her story here in a few minutes. Former Lion 101 is now in the Cradle of Aviation Museum up in Garden City, New York. Former Lions 105 and 106 are actually not that far from me. If you count a 3-day road trip as not that far from me. We'll start this tour, however, up in New York at the Cradle of Aviation Museum, where former Lion 101 is now on display. Former Lion 101, Bureau number 164603, is in the Cradle of Aviation Museum in Garden City, New York. This is the 711th Tomcat built, so it's the second to last one ever built. Of the 4 surviving Black Lion jets, this is the only one not displayed in VF-213 colors. She finished her career with VF-31, so she's displayed in those colors. This was the skipper's jet. In a squadron, the 1 jet is the commanding officer's jet. In Carrier Air Wing 11, VF-213 was assigned the 100s, so our jets were 100, 101, 102, etc. When the squadron transferred to Carrier Air Wing 8, they were assigned the 200s, so the jets became 201, 202, etc. But the 1 jet is always the CO's jet. His name is on it, or her name is on it. It's not exclusively flown by the CO, but during missions of importance, the CO will usually insist that his or her jet is ready to go. That's where 101 comes into play historically. October 4th of 2001, we launched VF-213, our first operational mission over Afghanistan. Now, operational does not mean strike. The official our retaliation for 9/11 had not begun yet. But our commanding officer, Commander Chip Biff King, flew that first operational mission in Lion 101, Bureau 164603. This jet, however, truly enters the history book on October 7th, 2001. The night of October 7th, VF-213, flying with Carrier Air Wing 11 off Carl Vinson, launched the very first manned strikes of Operation Enduring Freedom. Air Wing 11 and Carl Vinson, we took the night shift. Enterprise and later Theodore Roosevelt took the day shift, so they launched their first strikes on October 8th. This aircraft, Bureau number 164603 as Lion 101, being flown by Commander King with Lieutenant Commander Paul Gronemeyer as his backseater, led that first manned strike and was first off the flight deck. F-14 Tomcats, F-14 Deltas did not go to afterburner on launch because our engines were so big and so powerful we didn't need to. That makes night launches of Delta Tomcats a little tricky to film because you don't have that big rocket ship glow at the back lighting up the sky. This jet achieved another historical first by becoming the first Tomcat in all of F-14 history to engage ground targets with its 20mm cannon during combat. On the 5th of November 2001, Commander King responded to a request for aerial support by strafing the living tobacco juice out of Taliban forces on the ground. Once we were back at Oceana, this jet was transferred out of VF-213. I believe it went to the depot for maintenance and then was transferred on to VF-31, where it finished its career. I helped prep this jet for transfer out of 213 after we got back home from that deployment. Prepping a jet for transfer out of the squadron, whether it's going to go to the depot for heavy level maintenance or straight to another squadron, involves deep cleaning the jet, making sure every single part and piece that's listed on the equipment manifest is there. So that way you hand an aircraft over to the next owner that's ready to fly. Basically, the next owner, be it the depot or another squadron, their pilot can get in the jet, stick the ignition key in, turn it on, and go flying. This Tomcat is not the last one that flew a combat mission. That's another Black Lion jet we'll be talking about in a few minutes. But this Tomcat is the final Tomcat to fly. This jet is the last one that ever took off and ever landed. She is displayed in the color she retired in, which was with VF-31, but to all of us Black Lions, she's always going to be Lion 101, the jet that led the strikes of Operation Enduring Freedom. F-14 Delta Bureau number 161163 is the 390th Tomcat built. Back in my day, when we were in Carrier Air Wing 11, this was Lion 105. After 213 shifted into Carrier Air Wing 8, she became Lion 205, and that's how she retired. This aircraft currently resides at the Prairie Aviation Museum up in Bloomington, Illinois. Nice little facility, does not take long to go through, and they've got some very historic aircraft there, including Lion 205. Got a bit of photographic trivia regarding this aircraft. This is the only one of our jets I have any imagery of launching a weapon during Operation Enduring Freedom. I did not take these photos. These were shot by Lieutenant Tony Elroy Toma from another one of our jets as Lion 105 launched a Phoenix missile into Afghanistan during Operation Enduring Freedom. I don't have a lot of sea stories about this aircraft for the same reason I don't have many regarding one of the other Black Lion jets that still survive. This aircraft was reliable. She didn't spend much time in the hangar, nor did she blow many proverbial gaskets during the launch cycle. Aircraft that did blow that metaphorical gasket during startup required a lot of high-speed, low-drag repair work while the engines were still turning in order for us to try and get that jet to the catapult on time. Having to shift the aircrew munitions to a backup jet was a time-intensive procedure, especially during combat operations, so we appreciated the aircraft that did not do that to us. Bureau number 161163, old Lion 105 and now Lion 205, was a steady workhorse that we could depend on. She arrived at the Prairie Aviation Museum in Bloomington, Illinois in April of 2006. In fact, her final flight was to the Bloomington Normal Airport. The 603rd Tomcat built is F-14 Delta Bureau number 163893. Back in my day, this was Lion 106, and she was our single highest scoring jet during Operation Enduring Freedom. When VF-213 finished deployment and we returned to NAS Oceana in Virginia Beach, she had 70 confirmed strikes on her fuselage. Once this jet was retired, she was put on display outside Arnold Air Force Base in Tullahoma, Tennessee. Former Lion 106, now Lion 206, joined numerous other aircraft, Army, Air Force, and Navy around the base. Each aircraft is dedicated as a memorial to the memory of a fallen aviator, and Lion 206 has been dedicated to the memory of Lieutenant Kara Hultgreen. Lieutenant Hultgreen was the Navy's first female-based carrier combat pilot. She was actually with VF-213 in October 1994 when her F-14 experienced engine trouble. She ended up crashing into the Pacific Ocean. Her Rio ejected safely, but Lieutenant Hultgreen was killed because her ejection seat fired after the aircraft had rolled and she was shot directly into the ocean. Two of the surviving Black Lion jets have a very personal photographic connection to me, or perhaps I should say I have a personal photographic connection to them. Bureau number 161159, which is on display here in Pensacola, was the subject of what I consider to be the greatest F-14 photo I ever took. However, this aircraft, Bureau number 163893, is the aircraft in the photo that then Commander Guyani commissioned me to get for that special recognition certificate he was putting together. On a more personal note, on the 1st of August in 2002, I jumped up on the back of this aircraft and had one of my buddies take a picture of me leaning on the vertical stabilizers. Of all the things I've done in the Navy, all the places I've been, all the photos that were taken of me in and out of uniform, this photo has always been my absolute favorite photo of me in the Navy. This photo represents how I see myself as a sailor to this day. An Airedale on top of his aircraft. Being able to stand behind this jet outside Arnold Air Force Base of all places, 23 years after I took that or had that photo of me taken, really brought home the passage of years. But it also kind of, in a very odd way, brought home not just how difficult it was being an aircraft maintainer, and it is. It's a high pressure job. There's a lot going on, a lot of physical labor, a lot of tight timetables. It's a high stress job. But it also brought home just how great a job it was. 23 years later, I got to stand behind this same aircraft and remember taking a photo, a quick, casual little happy snap that ended up becoming the defining portrait of me as a United States sailor. And that brings me to Bureau number 161159, my old friend here in Pensacola. This was the 386th Tomcat ever built. In my day at VF-213, we were part of Carrier Air Wing 11, so our nose numbers were all 100. VF-213 was assigned the 100s. At that time, this aircraft had the nose number 111, 111, or triple sticks. She stayed with VF-213 the rest of her career. Now, after I left VF-213, the squadron transferred into Carrier Air Wing 8. All the nose numbers changed, so she retired with nose number 204. But it's the same aircraft. When you're actually working on these aircraft, it's your daily job, the daily grind. You're getting up early in the morning and dragging yourself to the flight line, or getting up early in the morning and dragging yourself down to the mess decks before heading up to the roof. They're the aircraft. They're our aircraft. We care about them. We love them. We love to hate them. We love to curse them. But they're our jets. But looking back through my diary from those days, through my emails and my photos, I kind of came to realize I had call it a relationship, almost a friendship, with two jets more than any other. Old Lion 106 and Lion 111. Well, old 106 is up in Tennessee, outside Arnold Air Force Base. Lion 111, Bureau number 161159, it was just one of those aircraft that, again, I just feel like I had a connection with in that kind of odd way that we have a connection with vehicles, or certain vehicles anyway. Interestingly enough, as I was producing this documentary, I also discovered that Bureau number 161159, I photographed that aircraft more than any other Tomcat in the Black Lion fleet during my time at VF-213. She doesn't win by much, but she is still hands down the winner. I have more photos of her than any other. She was just always there. I don't know if it was the hand of God, the hand of fate, or just dumb luck, but that aircraft popped up in so many photos. It was almost like she was stalking me as I look back at it now. In fact, the one time I hopped up on the back of one of our jets to photograph the Oceana flight line and get that nice overview, I didn't pay attention to what aircraft I jumped up on. I just jumped up on an aircraft and took the photo. That was 2002. 23 years later, as I'm producing this documentary, I pull that photo up to use. And for the very first time, I finally look at the wings to see what number she was, because the nose number is also repeated on the wings. First time I ever looked down, what aircraft was I standing on? Of course, triple sticks, Bureau number 161159. And now that aircraft is in Pensacola, where I end up living. I swear she's stalking me. The reason this aircraft is here, the reason this aircraft came to the Naval Aviation Museum and is not going to be loaned out anywhere else, Bureau number 161159 is the last F-14 Tomcat to ever fly a combat mission. She was not the last one to fly. That was old Lion 101, which is now in the Cradle of Aviation Museum in New York. But she was the last one to fly in combat. When I left VF-213 and went to Guam on shore duty, I had every intention of going back to Tomcats. Of course, the Tomcat fleet retired while I was overseas, and then, despite the promises Navy leadership had made to us, my application to cross right into aviation structural mechanics was denied. So whether I liked it or not, in 2006, I was going to become a mass communications specialist. So I'm at the Office of Naval Intelligence, now as a mass communications specialist, when I see in the newspaper that the last Tomcat to fly a combat mission was being donated to the Naval Aviation Museum. And they had pictures of the aircraft, the big nose number 204, never showed a bureau number. So I didn't know what aircraft it was, if it was one of the ones that I had worked on. The reason I know the ones I worked on so well is when we got off deployment in 2002, I took a photo of the nose of every aircraft so I could record the scoreboard. And in the metadata, I'd save the bureau number with that aircraft. So those bureau numbers, they're not memorized, but I'm familiar with them. I was coming home on leave in May to Niceville, where my folks live. I got my dad and I a behind the scenes tour at the Aviation Museum. So we met a docent, went out onto the flight line, and the first stop was the restoration hangar. And Pop and I got to climb into a very historic old seaplane. This is a honkin' big PB2Y 5R Coronado. These things are long distance transport flying boats. And what makes this one specifically historically important was it was configured to transport Admiral Nimitz. This was an airplane Admiral Nimitz flew on, and my dad and I got to climb around inside it with the docent. And that airplane today is on display in the museum, fully restored, but of course you can't go inside it. After that, we headed out onto the flight line. Docent had us in a little golf cart, and he was driving us up one of the rows of airplanes, talking about the different aircraft. We came down the other row, and we could see the Black Lion jet coming up. We all got out of the golf cart. Pop and the docent started talking, and I just kind of started wandering around the jet, just reminiscing. As I'm walking around the jet, I happened to look down, and I looked at the bureau number, 161159. It wasn't a flashback per se, but as I'm looking at this beautiful, clean aircraft with all the bright colors, it was like somebody took a partially transparent overlay and superimposed it over my vision. I suddenly saw this tactical gray, grimy, beat up jet. I turned to my dad. Pop, I know this aircraft. I've worked on this one. Of course, he, like, how the hell do you know that? And I pointed out the bureau number. And then he wanted to know how I remembered the bureau numbers so well, and I had to explain I'd written them all down 4 years earlier. Still didn't know the nose number at the time, but suddenly I'm touching an aircraft I touched only 4 years prior on a flight deck. But when you're in the military, 4 years might as well be a lifetime because so much changes so fast. Things happen with such a rapid pace. When Pop and I got back to Niceville that night after dinner with Mom, I pulled out my laptop that I had at the time and looked up the photos of my Black Lion days. I'd brought them with me since Pop and I were going to go see a Black Lion jet. Searched through the scoreboards and discovered that 161159, current Lion 204, hey, she's old triple sticks. I never thought in my wildest dreams I would end up being one of those veterans who's talking to people in a museum that you just run into and the conversation turns to the aircraft you're looking at. I never imagined I would be that vet saying, I worked on this aircraft, the one you're touching right here. Yeah, launched it into war. It's a very unique experience. In one fell swoop, I feel very old, and in another fell swoop, I feel incredibly lucky. Lion 204, Bureau number 161159, her claim to fame is not solely having made that last combat flight. Operation Enduring Freedom. We launched the first strikes on October 7th of 2001, and I will talk about that next year when I do a documentary about the 9/11 attacks. Line 101, which is now in the Cradle of Aviation Museum in New York, she launched the first manned strike mission that night, piloted by our commanding officer, Commander Chip King. Before that mission went off, though, that afternoon we launched a TARPS mission to get aerial reconnaissance over the target area. Lion 111, Bureau number 161159, flew that TARPS mission. This aircraft got the first reconnaissance imagery that was used for the first targeting maps for the first strike of OEF. If I'm ever having a down day or a bad day or just I'm bored here in Pensacola, head to the museum and visit my old friend, and at least for a few minutes, there's a little bit of sadness always. Some guys have passed on. I miss them. But most of the time, it usually brings a smile to my face because what I've gained from being part of naval aviation is indescribable. And I am so grateful for it. I'm so grateful that Bureau number 161159 is right here in Pensacola, and I can see her whenever I want. For the past 19 years, ever since 2006, when Dad and I discovered that Bureau number 161159, old triple sticks, was here in the collection of the Naval Aviation Museum, I've considered myself the luckiest sailor, one of the most fortunate Airedales in the Navy. I get to go visit an old friend effectively. I get to walk in and see an aircraft I helped make fly. Researching this documentary and discovering that 3 more of our birds still exist means the world to me. There are 4 Black Lion aircraft in 4 different states. Not many people can say that. Those of us who are in the Black Lions from the year 2000 through at least 2002, we can say that. We can take our friends and our family, our children, and walk up to one of these jets and say, I made this one right here fly. The one you're touching, I helped make that fly. Or for the air crew, that one you have your hand on, I flew in that over Afghanistan in combat. Beyond the nostalgia of just walking up and reliving the grand glory days of those grimy, hot, loud, long hours on a flight deck, it means a lot because it's a concrete reminder that we're not forgotten, that what we did had meaning. And even if our time has passed, we were building the future for the Airedales who are on those decks today defending our country. In mid 2012, I detached from USS Ponce, and well, we all detached from Ponce because she was being transferred to the Military Sea Lift Command. I reported aboard Navy Public Affairs Support Element East, or NPACE East. The worldwide NPACE command exists to put enlisted mass communication specialists and public affairs officers on the ships and other assets the Navy is deploying. Only the carriers and the large deck amphibious assault ships have a permanent media center and a permanent media team, but those are only 50% manned. NPACE brings the other 50% of those personnel to the ship for the mission, while also putting independently deployed personnel on the smaller decks that normally don't have a media presence. So I was the leading petty officer of the detachment going aboard USS Dwight D. Eisenhower, CVN 69. Had a couple of sailors with me on the Ike, and I had a couple of sailors that were deployed to our smaller units, and I was their leading petty officer via email. Once we transited into the Mediterranean, we fell into formation with the French nuclear carrier Charles de Gaulle. Did several joint exercises, and one day the de Gaulle and the Ike took aboard numerous, and I mean numerous, NATO dignitaries and visitors, and a plethora of press. The ships were going to do a joint air show. I was tasked with being one of the media escorts, and I was assigned to 2 French reporters. I cannot remember their names, and I wish I could because these guys were great. They were a lot of fun. I really got some exercise that day because these 2 French reporters, oh my God, they wanted to see everything. We were back and forth and up and down and all over that carrier. As we got near the air show time of that afternoon, I asked them where they wanted to set up shop to watch the air show. A lot of the dignitaries and reporters were going to go onto the Ike's flight deck once we launched the aircraft and watch it from there. These 2 guys wanted to go up to Vulture's Row, the observation levels up on the island. I told them that's not a bad idea. It's going to be a great vantage point, but we need to get up there over an hour early because Vulture's Row is a narrow space and it is going to fill up. A little over an hour early, we headed up to Vulture's Row and got up there just before everybody else. We were talking and they were asking me questions about what's that and what's that. And like, okay, well, that's the foul line. You do not step across that line while aircraft are landing or you will likely die. Oh, that over there, that's the PKP marker. That's a firefighting agent. So things like that. They remarked about how amazing it was. I knew so much about the flight deck, and they told me they're not trying to put anybody down, but of all the media escorts they'd ever had, I had the most intimate knowledge of flight deck operations. So I told them I used to be a flight deck maintainer. I used to work on F-14s a long time ago. Eyes get wide. They look excited. They look at each other. They look back at me, and one of these guys says, and I am not going to try and do it with a French accent. So he looks at me. F-14s? Sex with wings. I've known about the F-14 since I was 9 years old and saw them in a movie. I've known they were a significant part of U.S. military aviation all my life. That was the moment, though, I realized just how mythical, how legendary the Tomcat has become, not just for our country, but around the whole world. VF-213 and USS Ponce were the two greatest commands I was ever part of. Naval aviation is my first and greatest love, always will be. But Ponce gave me back that sense of adventure, that sense of purpose, that sense of being part of something bigger than me. When I started this channel originally, I didn't quite know what I wanted to do with it. Once I kind of sorted that out and began the Pierside programming to specifically tell sea stories, I started with stories from the Ponce for two reasons, one emotional, one practical. On the emotional side, I'm so grateful to Ponce and the proud lions I served with because they gave me back that purpose, that sense of adventure. They restored a meaning to my Navy career that had been lost when I got thrown out of aviation. On the practical side, when I was a Black Lion, my job was fixing airplanes. When I was a Proud Lion, my job was being the entire media team. I have a truckload more material in my archives from Ponce than I do any of my earlier commands. Ponce was easiest to start with because I just have so much material. It's easy for me to pull from my own archives right here in my home and put those stories together. It's taken a couple of years to get my video skills and my storytelling skills to a point where I feel comfortable now delving into stories from my earlier commands where I don't have the same amount of material. So I have to find other ways to tell that story, make it entertaining and understandable. Besides, I gotta ask, who else could take a story about F-14 Tomcats and a story about the last of the Austin class amphibious transport docks in the Gator Navy, put them together and create one seamless narrative of Navy adventures? Only me. That's who. I've got a lot more Tomcat memories and sea stories than I've got in this documentary. However, one final sea story that I wanted to share in this documentary is the photo within the photo. I'm used to people taking pictures of me taking pictures. One of my favorites was back on Guam in March of 2003 when an Air Force buddy caught me as I was covering the departure of USS Carl Vinson from a port call to the island. So I've got photos of me taking photos. There's only one photo, however, of me taking a photo that shows me in the photo I'm taking. The photo I was shot shooting was early October 2001. I will go into 9/11 and its effects on our squadron and our ship next year in another Pierside episode. This was the first operational mission we were launching as we got ready to actually start striking back. That is the background of why I happen to be taking this particular image. One of our other guys saw me kneel down to take the photo, and he pulled out his little digital camera and snapped a picture of me taking the picture. His timing was so perfect that when he snapped me taking the picture, he snapped a photo of me as I was hitting the shutter to snap the photo of the plane captain. My whole career as a professional photographer, this is the only time I was ever photographed inside the photograph I'm taking. The Grumman F-14 Tomcat grew out of needs the Navy had dating back to the 1950s. The fleet of jets made their debut on the flight deck in the 1970s, and the Tomcat would hold on to arguably the top spot in the Navy fighter hierarchy until the 21st century. However, the fleet was aging. Just as an example, the Tomcat at Pearl Harbor on display there was supposed to be the final Tomcat to fly. Felix 102 was supposed to make the historic last flight of the entire Tomcat fleet, but she got grounded because of a generator issue. So another bird had to get spun up at the last minute and put in the air to make that final flight. That just shows you the kind of maintenance nightmare the Tomcat had become by the mid-2000s. The aircraft, those airframes were almost 30 years old. They had been put through a lot. Tomcat was simply reaching the end of its natural life. The F-213 Black Lions, that was the single greatest time of my entire Navy career, and I still to this day first think of myself as an Airedale. First image that always comes to mind of myself is standing on the back of 106, leaning on the vertical stabilizer, a maintainer with his aircraft. USS Ponce, the Proud Lion, is a very close photo finish second. The Ponce and my shipmates there kind of pulled me out of a very dark, depressed place I was in after I got thrown off the flight deck when the rating merger, when the photographer's mate rate went away and everything changed. It's hard enough to go through change, but when senior leadership reneges on promises you were counting on, it's very demoralizing. Working on a flight deck and being part of a squadron is not all wine and roses. I've shared some of the more dangerous moments that all of us up there can face and a couple of the dangerous moments I personally faced. We had plenty of fights amongst. I've seen everything from arguments to fist fights with guys in other squadrons, between squadrons and the ship, and between guys in my own squadron, in the Black Lions. We're human. We get stressed out. We get tired of each other. We're stuck with each other for months on end in this little tin can called an aircraft carrier. And then we go to war, so the stress level and the operational tempo is ramped up even higher. It is not an easy life. The Navy is not an easy life, even in peacetime. But it can be a very good life if you're willing to put in the work, find the shipmates around you who will have your back, and keep in mind that a great adventure is not all good times. Think about it. We go to the movies for sex, drugs, and rock and roll. Part of what makes adventure movies so great is watching those heroes face adversity, suffer through the trials they have to overcome, the challenges to defeat the villain and save the day. A real life adventure is the same way. Part of what makes it so great, if I can paraphrase a movie, part of what makes it so great is the fact it was hard. Everybody who contributed to this, I want to thank you all for your time. The story of a squadron and the story of a ship is not the story of one person. It's the story of the squadron, the story of the ship. My story, as I've related here, only happened because all of you were there living and writing your own stories, and you've chosen to share some of that with me and with my audience. Thank you very much. That has created a much more cohesive narrative that shows this is a world that goes just beyond one Airedale. It was a whole team of people working together. Sometimes we did it happily and in harmony. Sometimes we were ready to throttle each other, and we were only doing it because we were legally obligated since we're in the military. But we all did it, and we did it together. Thank you for your time in helping me tell this story. This is clearly not the end of my Tomcat story, but this documentary is the heart of my Tomcat story and why to this day I will always consider myself an Airedale first. I hope you've enjoyed this documentary, and I hope you will join me when I get around to those stories in the next few years. Thank you for your time. I appreciate you spending the last 4.5 hours with me and my shipmates, reminiscing about our days in F 14s. Until we meet here again on Sparks 1524, have a great Navy day. Be safe, and remember, always, always go and do some great things.